Just welcome everyone to the Covideo Conference number, I think 10, this might be 9, this is. And it's a really good presentation today, I think, from 4 speakers in CSIRO around the Norilsk complex, I guess, and we'll find out a lot more about that. So my name is Ryan Noble, and I tend to host these every 2 weeks, and we usually post any of these videos we record, and we're putting out about 2 weeks after the event via LinkedIn and on YouTube and things like that. But I won't spend any more time introducing it. I'll let the team talk us through Norilsk. So over to you, Steve, Margot, Louise and Morgan.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. And thanks everybody for tuning in. So I'm going to do the introductory segment here, and then I'll throw to the other team members, and then wrap up a bit at the end. So let's just get straight in. So for the next sort of 45-50 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing over the last about 5 years now on the Norilsk Ni-Cu-PGE deposits. And we're not going to cover the full story, but we'll talk about some of the particular aspects of the ore forming processes and rock textures and so on and so forth that we've been focusing on. So let's straight away let's jump to where we are. So the little yellow arrow up here shows you the spot. We're in far northern Arctic Siberia, 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where it's currently hot. They've been having the hottest summer on record up there in the Arctic, to the point that the permafrost is all freezing. And also, I've heard, rather unfortunately, they're also having a COVID breakout in the city of Norilsk, which is not good news. Anyway, here's the Google Earth overview, and these brown flat top hills here are all basalts, and that whole sort of brownish area up there is all basalts, and this is the famous Siberian large igneous province, one of the greatest accumulations of basaltic volcanism in the history of the planet. It's all beautifully exposed out here on the tundra. So a bit of a sort of classic industrial northern landscape here. It's a pretty grim place, to be honest. And up until a few years ago, one of the Chinese cities overtook it, but it was one of the most polluted cities on Earth. Most of the cities and the older mines were actually all constructed by Gulag slave labor under Stalin in the 1950s. So it's got a pretty amazing history. That's the landscape on the basalts. Not a tree in sight. That's take care of the sulfur emissions from the smelter stacks. That was on a field trip in 2013, and I'd just like at this point so 2012, wasn't it 2012? 2012. And it's a good point to actually thank the organisers of that symposium, without which any of this would have happened. But there's some nice scenery too, and that's a lovely photo that from a famous locality that was sent to me by Marina Yudovskaya, who's also one of our collaborators in this work. So why are a bunch of Australians interested in Norilsk? Well, largely because they're such enormous ore bodies. So these are a couple of plots here. These are contained metal reserves and resources, PGEs, nickel, copper and nickel. And you can see the Norilsk camp sits out here right on the high end in terms of content of nickel, copper and PGEs. In fact, to the point where Norilsk actually has a large proportion of the world's PGE resources. And in fact, it's currently the largest producer, so slightly over 50% of the world's palladium at the moment is coming from Norilsk. And these things here are all the various bushveld deposits. So, a bit more about the setting. So here's a geological map, Siberian flood basalt province. 3 major components: lavas, pyroclastic rocks, and sills, roughly equal volumes of all 3. There's about 3 million cubic kilometers of mafic magma represented here, and in the other half of it, which you can't see, that's off to the left of the map under Cenozoic cover. The Norilsk camp is right up here, and zooming in there. Here's the basalts in green, the sediments in white. More about those in a tick. The ore-bearing intrusions are shown here. This is the planned projection of the intrusions. The Talnakh and Karalak intrusions here, and the Norilsk 1 intrusion down here. And one of the intriguing things about it is that the volume of these intrusions is actually minuscule compared to the total volume of the province. About 1/1,000,000th of the volume of the magmas, by my best estimate. Stratigraphy of the volcanic sequence is quite significant as well here. So this is a simplified stratigraphic column that I borrowed from Nick Arndt through the Siberian trap sequence. Don't worry about all of these complicated Russian names. The main thing you need to know here there are a couple of units. This one here we call the yellow basalts. These are strongly contaminated classic continental tholiites with lots of isotopic and trace element indications of crustal contamination. And they're very strongly depleted in platinum group elements, nickel and copper, which is something which Tony Nolder, Peter Lightfoot and co-workers demonstrated 20 odd years ago. And it's been one of the sort of cornerstones of the understanding of Norilsk geology. The ore-bearing intrusions in chronostratigraphic terms sit right here, equivalent to the very, very top of these yellow basalts in transition to the green basalts. And we've got those ages known quite a bit more precisely now. And it's one of the significant things about the age is that they exactly correspond to the largest mass extinction in Earth history. And this is a famous plot now from Covideo showing the correlation between the ages of major mantle plume related flood basalt provinces and oceanic plateaus correlating with the ages of major mass extinctions. That's the Permo-Triassic and the Norilsk intrusions right there. And in fact, we've got involved a little bit in talking about some of the mechanisms. This is from a paper that Margot's first author on, 2017 in PNAS, about the relationship between the degassing of the ore bodies and a possible sort of kill mechanism for the mass extinction. We're not going to be saying much more about that in this talk, but you can follow up on that reference if you want to read more about that. So homing in a bit more on the immediate setting, there are the ore bodies, a previous map that we saw. That blue thing there, that's the Norilsk-Talnakh fault. That's thought to be the feeder to the magmatism at this stage of the development of the province. And as you can see, the basalts sit pretty much directly on the thickest part of the basalts, which are the red contours here, sit pretty much centered on that feeder. And also the major ore bodies sit right underneath the thickest part of the development of these chalcophile element depleted basalts, which makes one of the Norilsk mysteries actually all the more mysterious, and we'll come to that as we go along. But one thing I wanted to point out here is that we actually have a remarkable coincidence of exposure here. The only reason we can actually see these things is because there are a couple of subsequent episodes of uplift, a couple of basement arches, which actually bring the base of the flood basalt sequence to the surface. Now, without those, these intrusions will be buried under 2,000 or 3,000 meters of basalts, and nobody would know that they were there. So the deposits as a whole form part of a class that we now call conduit-hosted deposits. That's a cartoon from an old paper of mine. And the basic idea being these are deposits which are formed in plumbing systems, transferring magma through the crust up to the surface. And one of the big ongoing arguments about Norilsk is to the extent to which the intrusions themselves are actually feeders to the volcanism. And there's been a big argument about that for many years. We're not going to get into that today, but we'll talk about that more in our workshop later in the year. This is what the intrusions look like. They're a classic example of what are now called chonoliths. It's an old Russian term. They're sort of ribbon-shaped, elongate sills. To more or less kind of tubular shape, flattened tubes, and with a sort of a central facies where all the mineralization happens, and then a series of flanking sills. With a strong internal differentiation, which we'll look at a little bit more in a tick, where they actually sit in relation to the stratigraphy. Those are the basalts. They're in green. In blue there, that's the Tunguska Formation. That's an extensive sedimentary unit which actually contains most of Russia's coal reserves, which may very well be an important part of the story. Down underneath them are these Devonian sediments, which are full of evaporite layers, and there are all these brown things over here in the strat column on the left. These are all evaporite units, so lots of anhydrite, lots of sulfate. Those are the mineralized intrusions shown there in green and red. The red are the actual ore bodies. We'll be talking about those as we go. These two major intrusions north of the anticline in the Talnakh region, close to Talnakh city, the Karalak intrusion here, and the Talnakh intrusion here, and that's what they look like in plan view. So this is a very schematic view of the internal internal organs are one of these things. This is a diagram from Tony Noldrick from the early 1990s. It's very stylized, and it's also greatly exaggerated. So there's a vertical exaggeration of about 5 times on that diagram. And I won't dwell on it. We're just going to talk mostly about 2 units here. We're going to be talking about this one, the picritic gabbro-dolerites. Louise is going to be telling you all about those. And also these upper taxitic dolerites, or gabbro-dolerites, which sit up mostly up in the tops of the intrusions and have all sorts of intriguing textures in, which you'll be hearing about later. So just having a look at the ore bodies, that's plan view down at the bottom right there, that's the Karalak intrusion again. The red things there are the ore bodies in plan view. Oktябрьский there, that's almost a kilometre down below the surface. And so now moving to the left here, that's a plan view of the Oktябрьский ore body. It's about 3 kilometres this way, about 1 kilometre this way, up to about 50 metres thick, with grades going up to, and these numbers are no mistake, 25% copper, 2 to 4% nickel, and 60 or 70 grams per tonne PGEs. So these are quite extraordinary ore bodies. In fact, this particular complex here contains somewhere close to $1 trillion worth of metals, and is probably the most valuable ore body of any kind anywhere on Earth. So now looking at this brown line here is the section above. And there are the massive sulfides at the bottom. They're very, very strongly differentiated into, with very, very high concentrations of copper in the middle. That's the residual fractionated sulfide liquid. Sitting above those, the picro-gabbro-dolerites with the globular sulfides in them. And then at the top, an ore type we're not going to be talking about today. These are the cuprous ores, which are very mysterious, possibly skarn-related, but also accounting for a large proportion of the mass of metal. So let's have a look at a couple of sort of iconic and very intriguing and revealing samples. So this is a sample of massive sulfide ore. This came from Marina Yudovskaya. And what you can see here is the classic pyrrhotite pentlandite sulfide. These bladed things here are anhydrite, so calcium sulfate. So this association between sulfide and sulfate is one of the defining characteristics of Norilsk. And also in this sample, we see these partially assimilated fragments of coal. So this is the real kind of smoking gun for some of the processes that are going on at Norilsk. So now looking at the picritic gabbro-dolerites, here in the lower part of the intrusion, these actually account for the bulk of the sulfide in the system. Most of them aren't actually mined because they would be mined anywhere else in the world, but in Norilsk the massive ores are so vast that they haven't needed to. But these very characteristic textures, you'll be hearing more about these globular sulfides sitting in a matrix of mostly olivine orthocumulates with these partially digested fragments of country rocks. And these are the so-called taxites, and this is another very critical part of the Norilsk story. This is the point where I'll bring in this little teaser for the wine glass Norilsk experiment. And if you want to hear how that relates to all of this, then you have to listen right to the very end, because that's where we're going to tell you what it means and show you how it works. Okay, so up at the top of the intrusions, the upper taxite with these intriguing vesicular textures. The red and yellow colours here are actually chromite, and these things are bubbles. It's a bubble foam where the bubbles are lined with chromite crystals. You'll be hearing more about those in a tip. And now, so this is the last one from me before I hand over to Margot. This is an old, very famous diagram now showing the sulfur isotopic compositions of the Norilsk ores. And this is something that's been known for a long time, first discovered by the Russians in the 1950s, I think. That the massive sulfides have very, very strongly sulfur-34 enriched isotopic compositions, well shifted across to evaporitic compositions here. The unmineralized intrusions, sulfides in the unmineralized or weakly mineralized intrusions, are much closer to mantle values. And the lavas, which are thought to be coeval with the intrusions, also have mantle-type sulfur. So this is sort of one of the enduring mysteries. So at this point now, I'll hand over to Margot to pick up the story on the work she's been doing on sulfur isotopes.
Okay, do I have to get out of there and reopen? All right, thank you, Steve, for this introduction. Oop. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about a case study that we've been working on with Steve, and I've been trying to get this along over the last couple of years now. And this is looking at using two different techniques, in situ laser ablation and in situ sulfur isotopic analysis to try and understand the ores that Steve was showing you. So in the picotic gabbro-dolerite, these globular sulfides. So the aim of the project was to study in particular two coexisting sulfide textures that we could observe. The blebby sulfides that are most of the time associated with what we would call a silica cap, which is a former bubble, and interstitial sulfides. So you can see those two different types on this sample here on the right. And so the aim here of this study was to gain a better understanding of the genetic processes that are at play for these two different populations, see if they're linked or not, or if they formed exactly at the same time by the same processes or not. And also try to see what that can tell us about genetic processes in general at Norilsk. So the tools, as I said earlier, are in situ laser ablation SCPMS that we have here in-house at ARC at CSIRO, as well as the one that they have at Curtin University, and sulfur isotope analysis done on the Chemicat 1280 that's at UWA at the CMCA. So just a quick background overview of how you actually form a magmatic nickel sulfide deposits for those of you who might not be that familiar with it. So first of all, you need the source of the metals, which is the mafic ultramafic melt, to come all the way up to the surface. There you need this melt to actually assimilate, well, actually that's the most accepted model, to assimilate sulfur from the contour rocks, so it actually reaches sulfur saturation. So this is what you can see here in this step here. Then these little sulfide droplets that have been segregated need to get enriched in metals and PGEs, and so this happens via the interaction with the silicate melt itself that contains all these elements that are chalcophyte elements. And then finally, by a process that we're still doing a lot of research on, you need to actually coalesce all of those sulfides and concentrate them in one spot to actually form the ore body. So the two processes that I'm going to talk about mainly today are sulfur assimilation. And to do that, we are looking at the sulfur isotopic compositions of our sulfides, as well as the interaction of the sulfide liquid with the silicate melt. And to do that, we're going to look at the metal and PGE enrichment of our sulfides. So this is a slide that you already saw that Steve was showing you to show you the setup of these intrusions and these ore bodies. So I'm not going to go into any details here, but we basically have samples from the picotic gabbro-dolerite globular ore sulfides that are this light red color here, from all three minerals intrusions, Norilsk-Talnakh and Norilsk 1. So this is what our samples look like. So this is here on the left is a micro CT 3D scan of one of our sample from the Norilsk intrusion, and this is to show you those two different textures that we're talking about with the large blebs and the interstitial disseminated sulfides. So we've got about 8 samples for this study here, all containing both blebby sulfides and disseminated interstitial sulfides. And so this is just from that one sample here. For example, there's about 2/3 of the sample sulfides that is contained within the blebs and 1/3 within the network and disseminated sulfides. And so we had about 4 samples from Norilsk, 3 from Norilsk, and then 1 from the Talnakh intrusion. So here, to start with, the results of the sulfur isotopic analysis of those samples. So as Steve mentioned briefly, you can see that these samples have really heavy delta 34 sulfur isotopic compositions, going from 5 to 17 or 18 here. The 3 different intrusions spread over this whole range. And within each intrusion, you actually have a wide variation in between samples. So here, Norilsk goes from 4 to 9, for example, parts per million. The Norilsk is the one that has the widest range of composition here, like going all the way from 7 to 17 parts per mil delta 34 sulfur. So this is a very important thing at Norilsk, this really heavy sulfur isotopic signature, and it's attributed to the fact that the sulfur, a large part of the sulfur, comes from the country rock, the sediments that are rich in anhydrite and sulfates that Steve was mentioning, that actually have a sulfur isotopic composition that's around 1820 at least. Now if we compare the two different textures that I was talking about, blebby and disseminated ores, so this is what we get. So this is delta 34, this is like box plots for 34 sulfur. So these are the samples from the Characteristic intrusion, here from the Norilsk intrusion, and then on the right here from the Talnakh intrusion. And what you can see is that there's no significant difference between the bleb and the disseminated sulfides. They show similar values in 34 sulfur, although the values do change quite widely between the intrusions, as we saw earlier. For Characteristic here, where there seems to be maybe a slight difference between blebby and salt and disseminated, that's actually only due to one specific sample. So there are the 4 samples from Characteristic intrusion, and one of them, ZF12, has really elevated values of delta 34 compared to the others. What you can see is that within one sample, both blebby and disseminated still show exactly the same range of 34 sulfur values. So this is telling us that both sulfide population have assimilated probably the same sulfur and have undergone the same sulfur assimilation history, as well as rehomogeneation with the silicate melt, so that they both have the same composition. Now, if we look at the PGE enrichment of the sulfide, so this is a plot from a recent paper by Steve and others, where you're looking at palladium tenors here from various different ore bodies versus palladium in pentlandite. And what you can see here, there's a really good correlation between the two. And so that's why we are going to use palladium in pentlandite as a proxy for the original PGE enrichment of our sulfide liquid before crystallization and before PGM forms. So here is the data for palladium in pentlandite for our samples. So these are samples from Norilsk, the Talnakh sample, and samples from Characteristic. And what we can see here is that in general, between the blebby and the sulfides, they still show a similar range of palladium in pentlandite values. There's a few little variations, but nothing very significant. So this is also telling us that those two sulfides would be coming from the same population. Now, when we started looking in more detail at the actual 3D scans of the samples that Belinda Godel here at ARC collected for us and processed, what we saw is that the blebs and the interstitial sulfides that we called two different populations were actually, for a large part of them, interconnected. And they were forming these big interconnected networks between the large blebs and the interstitial sulfides. And so we started to wonder if maybe we had to change a little bit how we were looking at those. And so there's two different interpretations on how those form. And we think that the actual, so basically we think that the interstitial sulfides here form via infiltration of the large blebs into the silicate framework. And so there's two different scenarios here. Is if you are looking at the same population, you'd have the blebs here and the isolated little sulfides that would have the same 34 sulfur and palladium content. And then after sulfide infiltration from the sulfides into the silicate network, those three would still have obviously the same sulfur 34 and palladium content. However, if those two populations are different to start with, and they have a different delta 34 and different palladium content, after infiltration, those two here, where the sulfides have infiltrated, would indeed have the same values in 34 sulfur and palladium content, but the few blebs that are still isolated within this network, the silicate network, would still have a different delta 34 and palladium content. So to try and test this, we decided to take a few more samples. So we used the 3D scans to actually take a few samples that were targeted at aiming at only these little sulfide blebs here that were completely isolated from the blebs and the large sulfide networks we could see. And so these are the results that we got. So there's, in blue here, you have those completely isolated sulfide compared to the disseminated interconnected network. and the blebby sulfides. And what you can see is that there does seem to be some kind of a difference and some kind of a trend where you have higher palladium in pentlandite in the fully isolated blebs here. And this is interesting, and it actually correlates not as strongly, but it does correlate a little bit with the sulfur acidic values that we find in those 3 samples, where there's a wider range of compositions here in this isolated sulfide, and they also have the lightest delta 34 sulfur values. So maybe originally there were 2 different populations with the interstitial really small sulfide blebs having maybe interacted more or more easily because they have a larger surface that actually interacts with the silicate melt, and then having been enriched more than the large blebs. And then now in the rocks, because there's such a interconnected network, the large blebs and the interconnected networks now have the same composition through diffusion within the sulfides, whereas the small isolated blebs still have their original composition. So really quickly now, I'm just going to talk a bit about the relationship between that we would expect between sulfur values and palladium in pentlandite content. So this is from a paper by Lesher and Burnham in 2001, where they've modeled what you would expect the sulfur composition, sulfur 34 composition, to evolve with increasing R factor, so with increasing interaction between your silicate melt and your sulfide melt, and it would basically go down towards melter values around 0 the more you interact with the silicate melt. And here, as you would expect, the palladium values in the pentlandite there would increase with increasing R factors. And so if you get the 2 together and you plot palladium in pentlandite versus delta 34, you would expect to have this sort of a trend where with increasing R factor, you increase your tenors or your metal contents of your sulfides, but you decrease and you go towards a lighter 34 sulfur. However, when we plot our data with in situ data for both sulfur and pentlandite in the same grains, we actually don't see any significant trend. No obvious correlation between your sulfur 34 and your palladium in pentlandite. And that's a bit of a paradox. And that links with something that Steve really quickly mentioned, which is the sulfur azido paradox at Norilsk, where how do we explain that we have extremely elevated tenors that infer an elevated R factor and very heavy sulfur acidic compositions of your ore inferring a low R factor? And I'm not going to go into detail into this problematic, but that's something that we are currently studying a lot and trying to understand here with the team. And these are just a few snapshots from different studies that were published recently and that are in press. We're working quite a bit with Giada Iacono Marziano from the CNRS in Orléans, who's doing some experimental petrology work looking at assimilation of the country rock, and I think that might have a big role in this sulfur azidopic paradox. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Hopefully there's enough time for the 2 other speakers.
Alrighty. So moving on from the sulfides, I'm now going to talk to you all about the chemistry of the host rocks of the intrusion, so everything else that's not a sulfide. And if you came to us via Twitter, you would have seen this little pretty orb on the side here, which is a sample that we collected, well, that was given to us from the upper taxitic units of the Norilsk body. So these upper taxitic units are really important because they are very low in sulfide but extremely high in platinum group elements. So this image that you see on the screen, you'll see a few images like this in my talk. This is an X-ray fluorescent image. So it's a red, green, blue stacked image where the red corresponds to the concentration of chromium, green to iron, and blue to calcium. So these images were collected off the Australian synchrotron, and you can see that what looks like these relic bubbles are coated in spinels, so iron and chromium rich spinels. They're not only circular, they're completely spherical, which is why we took the CT image you saw in my first slide. So we can see that these bubble foams have a very, very strong association between the bubble and the spinel that surrounds them. So we don't have a lot of time to go into the details into this, but it was recently published in Economic Geology. So if you zap the little QR code in the top corner of the screen, and hopefully I'm not blocking it with my little video, you can go to that article and learn a little bit more. So moving down to the main body, which have the globular ore body, globular ore sections, you can see that the association between vapor and chromite continues. So here we have a very large sulfide globule that's surrounded by a vesicle, which is now infilled by clinopyroxene, and we have very large chromite surrounding this vesicle. And this is seen throughout the entire globular ore region. So these globular ores are hosted within what's known as the picrogabbro-dolerite. These zones have lots and lots of olivine. They're sometimes skeletal, suggesting that the olivine crystallize quite rapidly. They have these large globules of sulfide with the silicate caps that were once bubbles and vesicles. And they also have these clinopyroxene oikocrysts, which are important because the clinopyroxene oikocrysts form via really rapid crystallization of the clinopyroxenes, which trap early crystallizing phases and isolate them from further development of their texture and chemistry. So we're actually trapping the textural and chemical evolution of the Norilsk ore body formation. And as you can see, inside these clinopyroxene grains, we have both little grains of olivine, little grains of plagioclase, sometimes some chromites, but it's difficult to determine whether that's actually included inside the clinopyroxene. But we can analyze these little inclusions and tell a story about how the Norilsk deposits formed. So this was published recently in Economic Geology as well, in the Norilsk special issue, which just came out. So if you zap the QR code in the top corner, you can get to this article. When we analyze the inclusions of olivines within the clinopyroxene, which are shown in light green, you can see they're much more magnesium rich. And as we move towards the framework olivines, so these are the olivines that are not included within clinopyroxene, you can see that they become less magnesium rich. So as the evolution of as the deposit starts to crystallize, we evolve to less magnesium olivines. And then the same thing happens with the spinels. So you can see that the spinels that are touching the sulfide are more orange in color, which suggests that they're lower in chromium and higher in iron. And the ones that are trapped within the clinopyroxene are much more red. So looking at these in some quantitative chemistry, the spinels that are trapped inside the clinopyroxene, which is shown in green here, have much lower iron values. And then as we look at the spinels that are touching sulfide, they have much higher iron values, which suggests that the evolutions of the spinels during crystallization follow that little pattern. So this is all thanks to the minerals being trapped inside the clinopyroxenes. But the clinopyroxenes themselves can tell us a sort of story. So the clinopyroxenes in the Norilsk deposits are highly zoned. They have chromium-rich cores and drop to near zero chromium values at their rim. And also the rims of the clinopyroxenes are enriched in rare earth elements and other incompatible elements. So this is a little traverse of rare earth element patterns from the core of the clinopyroxene to the rim. You can see the pattern doesn't change much, it just increases in intensity. So during my PhD at ANU, I actually did a lot of partitioning of rare earth elements in clinopyroxene experiments. So I decided to try and invert the crystal chemistry of the clinopyroxenes, which we know are one of the first phases to crystallize in these intrusions, and see if we can work out what the parent magma would look like in their rare earth element patterns. So again, we have 4 basalts, Siberian basalts, that are temporally and spatially associated with the Norilsk intrusions. You can see that the green basalts, so Karolevsky, Mokolevsky, and Morangovsky, all have very similar trace element patterns. This is normalized primitive mantle. But the Nadajinsky suite, which is the yellow basalts, the ones that have this depletion in nickel, copper, and platinum group elements, have a very significantly different trend in the trace element whole rock analysis. So what I did was take the chemistry of the highest chromium clinopyroxenes, assuming they're the most primary, use the Petrology coefficients that I developed during my PhD at ANU, use the temperature, assumedly the liquidus temperature of each of the basalts, and then we're also assuming that basalt whole rock equals melt values for the clinopyroxenes. So using this, we can back calculate what the basalt rare earth element pattern would look like, which are these lines here. You can see that these lines from the 3 different samples that I analyzed all plot sort of similarly to the green basalts, but the yellow basalts are quite significantly different. Looking at the correlation between these data sets, you can see that the HR, which is the code for the Karolevsky green basalt, is the closest match for the chemistries that would make the clinopyroxenes in the Norilsk intrusion. So we were lucky at the Norilsk intrusions that pyroxene ended up being our time capsules. They grew so quickly that they trapped the chemical and textural evolution of the deposit solidification. We also can see that olivine, clinopyroxene, and plagioclase were all near liquidus phases that grew together, and that the cores of these clinopyroxenes best match the green basalts rather than the yellow basalts. But that was just using trace element values. So I'll pass it over to Morgan, who'll talk about the major element chemistry of these basalts and see if we can get any closer to determining what the parent magmas were.
All right, so I'm going to start where Louise left off and present a bit of a quick snapshot into some of the modelling work we've done to complement this, looking into what some of the Norilsk parent magma candidates might be. So this is about tackling some of the unanswered questions. And now that we've seen a bit of the petrography and mineral chemistry, how can we actually put this to use and investigate some of these potential relationships between the Norilsk deposit, as well as some of the associated basalt suites. So that the green basalts here, which are above the Norilsk deposit, as well as the yellow Nadajinsky basalts down here, and potentially get some insights into what the parental melts might have looked like. In this case, we're taking some of these basalts, which have the eruption ages quite close to the actual Norilsk formation ages, being these green and yellow basalt suites here. And by examining the crystallization path, and checking what's actually crystallizing as these melts cool, we can check whether we're on similar lines, liquid lines of descent, and whether we have similar phases crystallizing out. And given that we don't have a great control on what the volatile content of some of these magmas were, we can also look at some of these unknown parameters and put a bit of water into these melts as well. So to do this, we're using AlphaMelts, which is a fairly well-known command line-based tool, which provides thermodynamic models for melting crystallization numerical experiments. This is a really fast and cheap way to test a few geological scenarios and hypotheses. So as I said, we've taken a few compositions from these green basalts, as well as the yellow basalts here, being the Karolevsky, Mokolevsky, and Morangovsky basalts, which are all green, as well as the Nadajinsky basalts, which are yellow here. As you can see, they'll have very similar major element compositions. The Nadajinsky are a little more variable, as we'll see in a minute. And from the beginning, we can sort of say that we're suspicious about the Nadajinsky basalts given their trace element compositions, which Louise already mentioned. but maybe we can confirm this suspicion in this difference with the modeling too. So we're using shallow crystallization models at about 500 bar, and as I mentioned, we're varying the water content between dry models and a few 8% water. To go into the results of some of these, here's just one example. This is a Norilsk basalt, so the green suite, and noting here that this is a phase volume relationship during crystallization, and this is log scale on the Y. Temperature increases along here, so our crystallization experiments start on the right hand side, and with our liquid crystallizes in this direction. A few common phases throughout all of these. The clinopyroxenes are teal, plagioclase is pink, and olivines green, and spinel comes in here in grey. Mainly we're looking at the latter stages of these experiments, the start of these experiments, sorry. And the latter stages are less important for what we're actually looking at. So we're trying to find common features to compare to some of the Norilsk rocks. And some of the key features of these types of experiments is we can see that the first phases to come in during crystallization, in this case, are clinopyroxene, plagioclase, and then shortly thereafter, olivine. And generally, this kind of fits relatively well with what we've seen from some of the rocks before. This is one of Louise's examples of picrogabra dolomite. We can see we've matched the phases correctly. We've got clinopyroxene, we've got a bit of plagioclase, and we've got olivine. But maybe the key difference here is that the phase proportions are off. There's a lot more olivine in this rock than what we're seeing in our model. Before we go into a few more models, I just want to note some of the challenges with doing this on a larger scale. These models do generate quite a lot of information. We've run 102 different models for this presentation, and typically this is between a few thousand and 100,000 rows in these databases, so it can be a bit to dig into. The key thing here is we want to pull out models which are most relevant and see something which actually matches reality, and to do that we need to define what we're looking for. And what we're looking for in this presentation is really similar crystallization paths, so we're looking for assemblages where we're having olivine, plagioclase, and clinopyroxene crystallizing together, and generally very little orthopyroxene. We don't see much orthopyroxene in any of these rocks. So if you see a lot of orthopyroxene, it's probably a red flag. And we're also looking for similar mineral chemistry, so we can compare what's coming out of our models to what we actually see at Norilsk. Other things we could look at, which we haven't looked at, and what we talk about today, is looking for rapid clinopyroxene crystallization, given that the clinopyroxenes are oikocrysts, and also looking for similar phase proportions. We know that these models are a little bit off. And ideally, on larger scales, we want to do this in a fairly automated way to make it a bit quicker, just because we don't want to investigate 100 different models. And we're working on methods to do this, but we haven't got too far just yet. So to dig into some of these models, this is each of our 7 compositions. The green basalt suites are on top here. So this is Norilsk, Mokulevsky, Mongorovsky along here, and then Nadezhinsky basalts in yellow down the bottom. And we can see that generally, given their major element compositions are fairly similar, we're also seeing very similar crystallization paths. The assemblages that come out first are very similar, typically your clinopyroxene, plagioclase, and then shortly thereafter, a bit of olivine. The Nadezhinsky basalts have a bit more variable crystallization path, especially the ordering of olivine versus your plagioclase and clinopyroxene, and phase volume relationships are a bit more variable too. But otherwise, they're difficult to rule out in this case. When it comes to water contents, on the left here, we've got one Mongorovsky basalt with no water. So this is a dry experiment. On the right, we've added up to 2% water. And as you might expect, the dry model crystallizes a bit more rapidly, where you're having spinel and olivine come in at a bit later stage. On the right, we have interesting water saturated models. So the blue line here is a separate water phase. And generally what we see is that the crystallization of plagioclase, clinopyroxene, and olivine come much closer together. So you tend to have 3 phases crystallizing at the same time a bit quicker. The potential red flag with this one is that we have orthopyroxene coming in at the expense of olivine, which we don't really see at Norilsk. We do see it elsewhere. But the first phases coming off fit fairly well. We can also look at some of the mineral chemistry data and compare that to some of Louise's results. So here I plot up models as these dots in green, and also the Nadezhinsky basalt models in orange here. There's not too much difference between them, so generally see the overlap. And then Louise's data within these bounds, it's a 90% data density contour. Here is the cladoproxene and orthoproxene results. And generally what we see is that these are a bit offset. The model results are more luminous and also have lower magnesium numbers than what we see in reality. So there's a bit of an offset there. When it comes to spinel, we also see that there's quite a bit of an offset between the models and reality. The models give spinels, which are much more luminous and iron rich than what we see. There's not enough chromium around. And only these really late stage spinels get even close to the amount of chromium that we need. Olivine here, I've zoomed in just on the high temperature olivines, and these tend to fit relatively well to what we see in reality. And I've ignored some of the later stage iron and manganese rich olivines that come out of the models, but there's not too much to say about this one. So when it comes to analysing some of the commonalities of this, the compositions largely give the same crystallization histories for the same amount of water, which is our plagioclase, olivine and cladoproxene, which tend to come in quite closely together, which is maybe what we'd expect given the textures we've seen. However, there are a few things which are consistently off. Our olivine is underestimated, our orthoproxene is overestimated, our proxene compositions are a little bit off, and the spinel chromite content is typically underestimated. And there might be a few geological reasons as well as a few modelling reasons why this might be the case, one of which being we may have already crystallized a bit of olivine out of these basalts, so we're not quite accounting for that. And we know that some of the ore deposit formation processes themselves are largely fractional, and we haven't accounted for that either. So when it comes to this question, are these basalts genetically related to Norilsk? We can say that the green basalts up here more closely match in terms of the major element compositions as well as phase proportions if you add a little bit of water to these basalts. As for these yellow Nadijinsky basalts, overall we can't rule them out based on major elements and phase proportions alone, which is why it's so important to have that trace element data. And our models aren't too far off reality, but we don't really have any hard answers yet, so there's some more work to do in this. So there are a number of limitations and uncertainty with any modelling that you're doing. Part of this is just what we put in. We've looked at potentially the effect of water, but we could include other volatiles within the bounds of what melts can actually do. Compositional uncertainty can be important, but it's probably not in this case. And we know we probably have a bit of an issue with chromite stability, which is actually more of an alpha melts issue. And we haven't really dug into some of these more complex processes which we know are involved in ore deposit formation, especially those that are fractional and things that involve assimilation. And we're only seeing part of this picture with major elements, which is why integrating trace element data into some of these models might help clarify some things. So this, I think, is a good example of how to get a few new perspectives on some things by combining data which we have with models. In the end, these are numerical experiments, and they're really useful, especially if you start in a simple sort of place and they give us new questions to ask and phase relationships to chase in these rocks. And they're best used iteratively as a research tool. We'll be refining this with a few more models, potentially adding some modeling to some of these compositions and seeing what that does. Potentially adding in some trace element modeling and automating some of these similarity measures. If you want to see this presentation, it's on GitHub with all the data behind this and the tools. If you wanted to have a look at those, use Pyrolite and Pyrolite Melts Util, which is a wrapper around alpha melts, which enables you to do some of these batch calculations. And I'll hand over to Steve.
Just be a short pause. We've just got to reload the last presentation in the series here. Bear with us a second.
Do you need to open it again?
Oh, I changed it. I've created a new one called Summary.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're into the home stretch. So just for the last few minutes, I'll just summarise some of the things that we've covered and talk about what we think some of the remaining major research problems and sort of unsolved issues are at Norilsk. So the first one, the sort of the overwhelming kind of constraint for understanding these kinds of ore deposits, which runs through everything we've been talking about, is that these intrusions contain vast amounts of nickel, copper, and PGEs. And if you look at the volume of magma, if you look at the volume of the intrusions, then clearly there is way more, particularly platinum and palladium, in the ore bodies and can possibly have been dissolved in the volume of magma, which is now represented by the intrusions. And that's been recognised for a long time, and the conventional interpretation of that has been that the intrusions were conduits, so that sulfide was being left behind as the magma was flowing through them. Now, for a whole lot of reasons, partly because of some of the constraints from the phase equilibrium of the basalts that Morgan's just been talking about, but also just some basic geological constraints and increased understanding what the geometry of intrusions looks like. It's now becoming more and more apparent that the intrusions are probably not actually conduits directly to the surface. So there's a lot of new stuff that we really need to understand about how the dynamics of these systems are working. So the sulfur isotopes, so you heard the story there. It looks like there might potentially be two different populations. We still have this issue about how you reconcile the very obviously crustal signature of the sulfur isotopes in the deposit with the very high PGE contents. We still don't really know how that happens. But one possible part of the story here might be that there's more to the assimilation of the sulfur than just in most sort of conventional systems, where you essentially just melt sulfides in the country rocks and create what Mike Lesher has called a xenomelt. Norilsk, that may not be the story. What might be happening there is we're actually assimilating the sulfur as sulfate and then reducing it to make sulfide. And that's not a new idea, but there's some interesting new insights starting to develop into that. So sulfur isotope paradox I already mentioned. The one thing which is now pretty clear, and I think this isn't new, but I think so our data bears it out. The PGE depleted magmas, the yellow Nadezhinsky magmas, were not the parent magmas to the intrusions. It's possible that the green basalts could have been, but the green basalts that are actually erupted now don't look like they were. And so the way around that is either they had a lot more water in them, or the magmas that we're now seeing at the surface are substantially fractionated relative to the ones that actually formed the intrusions. So that's also an ongoing problem. And now these complicated ore textures that show that the magmas were degassing as the ore formed. That, combined with all of these other things we were talking about, raises some really interesting issues. How much did that actual sort of degassing process play? How much of a role did that actually play in the formation of the ore deposits? Was it connected at all? Is it just coincidence? Was it part of the ore forming process? Is it a consequence of the ore forming process? That gives rise to an intriguing set of questions. And particularly, and this is something that we're currently investigating now, did the degassing actually aid the coalescence of sulfide liquid droplets? Because one of the big problems in understanding how nickel sulfides form is we know that you can transport sulfide in magma, but you can only do it if it's transported as very small droplets. But if you've only got very small droplets, how do you actually get them back out of the magma and concentrate them to make massive sulfides? Did the degassing, did the volatile formation, did the bubbles actually play a role in that? So just before I move on to sort of the punchline, I just want to pay tribute to my former PhD supervisor and mentor and friend to many of us, Tony Noldrit. And Tony just passed away a few weeks ago. As well as being a huge inspiration for magmatic sulfide research generally, Tony also was one of the major figures who sort of opened the door for geological research in Norilsk over the last 30 or 40 years. So a huge contribution that we're all very much indebted to. So now here's the punchline. We promised you some instructions on how to make Norilsk in your kitchen. So here we have a wine glass with some olive oil and some water, a little bit of food dye, and into the bottom there goes some alka-seltzer tablets, soluble dysprune or whatever they are. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but anyway, so something that fizzes when you drop it in water. And this is a rather lovely little insight into what happens when you do that. So essentially, as you generate the bubbles in the water, those bubbles then generate a convective system in the oil above it. And there are all sorts of interesting things you can see going on. But one particular interesting one, if you look closely at those at the bubbles, those are actually droplets of of water, which in this analogy represents the sulfide, those droplets of water are basically being rafted through the oil by the bubbles, but they're also stirring and mixing with food coloring. And you can see if you look at those droplets and bubbles, you see that they have widely different shades of red, reflecting the extent to which they've actually reacted with the food coloring. So it's a really nice little sort of analog to some of the, I mean, a very sort of simple-minded, but still, I think, interesting analog of the sort of the physics of some of the processes that are going on in the intrusions. But the really intriguing thing is perhaps that they're telling us something about this distribution of ore textures, whereby we're getting these bubble froths, the low PGE sulfide ores developed at the top of the intrusions, and the globular sulfides in the gabbro-dolerites, which, as you've seen, these sulfide globules are also associated directly with vapor bubbles. So perhaps this is all part of the same story. And this is a bit fanciful, and there are lots of arguments about how well it fits with the actual geology. But I think it gives us some really interesting hints into some of the processes that might be going on while we're making these ore bodies. So anyway, there's lots more to learn about these things. We've got a lot still to understand, but we're really starting to learn some interesting stuff. So that's basically all we have to say. Just a few thank yous there. Nadia Krybulutskaya, Marina Yudovskaya, Sergei Shvizhenikin, and Dima Kamenetsky all provided samples and advice and insight and excellent arguments about this amazing piece of geology. And also a little bit of a plug for a workshop we're going to be running later on this year. We're not sure yet if we're going to be able to run it actually as a sort of live event here at ARC, or whether it'll be entirely online. But this will be a 1 to 2 day workshop on intrusion-hosted nickel-copper PGEs, with a good chunk of that devoted to Norilsk. There's all our Twitter handles up the top if you want to get in touch with any of us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Steve.